We know that God created sex as a way to perpetuate humanity. God even commands us to be fruitful and multiply. The question is, did God intend other purposes for sex? And if so, what were they? Please join me in briefly looking at the amazing gift of sex and God's design for it. In Genesis 2:23 through 24, sex is mentioned for the first time in the Bible. Adam has just finished naming all the animals, and he sees that there isn't a mate for him. So God creates Eve from Adam's rib. Adam says, "At last, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man." Verse 24 continues, "This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh." As a young girl, my parents taught me that sex was meant to be shared between husband and wife. Coming to my husband as a virgin was what God wanted from me. I didn't understand why this was one of God's rules, but I wanted to be a good girl, so I abstained until I got married. When my marriage failed, I guess I decided that since I'd already done the virgin thing and I couldn't do it again, I didn't have to wait till I got married again to pursue a sexual relationship. I got involved with a guy who taught me an entirely new view of sex. Sex was for pleasure, and there were no rules. I became hungry for that pleasure, and I let it control my life. I no longer viewed sex as a sacred bond between man and wife as God intended. Now I had two conflicting views inside me when it came to sex. On one hand, I viewed it as a way to give and receive pleasure. On the other hand, I had this instinct that told me sex was about love. I was desperate to be loved, so I chased after it using my body as a lure. I never caught love with my body, and honestly, I'm lucky I never caught a disease. All that I ended up with were meaningless encounters and relationships built on selfish principles that were never going to last. We see in Genesis that God made Eve from Adam. She came from his flesh. As husband and wife, when Adam and Eve make love, they become one flesh again. And this act is loving. Adam and Eve have entered into a covenant bond. Now you may wonder what a covenant bond is and why it is so important. The Lexham Bible Dictionary describes a covenant as a sacred kinship bond between two parties ratified by swearing an oath. People often remark that marriage is just a piece of paper. That is contractual thinking, not covenant thinking. See, a contract is a promise made between both parties where properties and possessions are legally shared as long as the parties agree or until the contract ends. And unfortunately, around 50% of marriages end in divorce. A covenant, however, is a permanent oath where both parties agree before God to love and respect each other for their lifetime. Mark 10:9 tells us that what God has joined, no man should separate. See, sex is how this type of covenant relationship is consummated. When a couple comes together to make love, they are connecting on three levels: spiritually, emotionally, and physically. We become one. And this is not just a physical oneness, but a spiritual one as well, because we allow the most intimate parts of ourselves to commingle. We show love by touching, speaking our hearts, giving each other our time and tenderness as we give and receive pleasure. This is an act of deep connection between husband and wife, and the union binds the couple together, making them a part of each other, just like the Holy Spirit becomes a part of us when we surrender our lives to God. Each time a husband and wife make love, it renews that covenant bond between them, and that glorifies God. Now you may be asking, what if I don't want to enter into a covenant bond? After all, why would God give us sexual desires if we weren't meant to use them as we see fit? Well, you are free to think that way and to make that choice. But there are consequences. Peter warns us in 2 Peter 2:10 that God is especially hard on those who follow their own twisted sexual desires. Make no mistake, any deviation from God's plan for sexual union is considered a twisted sexual desire in God's eyes, no matter how much you may love each other or how much fun you're having. The total destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is a great example from the Bible of God's wrath against sexual sin. I know sex feels good and it is so tempting, but when you view sex casually, you cut yourself off from the fullness of the experience God created sex to be. As I mentioned, sex connects you with your partner spiritually, emotionally, and physically. This isn't avoidable, and it will occur regardless of how casual the encounter is. That's just how God designed it. Every time you have sex with a partner, you create a bond with that person, and each time you repeat that act, you strengthen that bond. That's why Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 6:18 that sexual sin is a sin against your own body. You are hurting yourself when you choose to have sex outside of marriage, and you are hurting the other person because you leave behind a permanent, unfulfilled connection between the two of you. Premarital sex just isn't worth it. I am so glad that God helped me to understand His design for sex so that I can share it with you. This intensely personal expression of love and commitment brings fulfillment and joy to both husband and wife, and it strengthens their relationship. As a parent, I will be teaching my daughter that sex is a sacred gift from God. I hope that as she takes steps into maturity and relationships, she will wait for marriage so that she can experience sex as God intended it, with all its richness and beauty. If you would like to know more about the intimate way a husband and wife connect, communicate, and renew love through sex, I recommend reading When Two Become One: Enhancing Sexual Intimacy in Marriage by Christopher and Rachel McCluskey. Until next time, God bless and keep you.